record this. Well, these are the three most famous empiricists. They're not the only ones, but these were three philosophers who really define modern philosophy and the issues they talked about. Even if you think, well, we're not into the 20th century, but a lot of the issues that were discussed here in the late 1700s were rehashed in the early part of the 20th century. Instead of talking about Locke's ideas as the objects of perception, they instead wanted to make their philosophy sound more scientific in the 20th century. So instead of talking about perceptions and ideas like the modern philosophers did, they were talking about sense data and a sense datum as the proper object of perception. We call them the British empiricists because they were from the British Isles, and it's fitting that we should be doing this on a day like today, because again, I can save you $2,000 in airfare. If you were thinking of going to the British Isles, just walk out there today. That's what it's like. I mean, that's what it's like in like August. I was over there for two different academic conferences in 1985, and I had 10 days between them to be a tourist. I was over there for about 3 weeks in Scotland, England, and Ireland. And out of 3 weeks, I had two sunny days. The rest of it was weather like this. Anyway, so John Locke is from England, George Berkeley from Ireland, David Hume from Scotland. But since it's all part of the British Isles, we call them the British empiricists. So, unlike rationalism, and again, these are not pages in your text, but empiricism, we have one of the texts we used to use define it as the philosophy that demands that all knowledge comes from experience. In other words, reason doesn't give us some special insight into deep reality. And also, we'll see, for the empiricists, we don't come into this world with knowledge already embedded in our souls, like Socrates and Plato thought, and like the later rationalists, like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz thought. An empiricist maintains that we can know something if we can justify it with respect to what our five senses tell us, to what we see, hear, smell, touch, or taste. So we saw a tradition that began with Plato and Socrates and extended through Descartes and the other rationalists of downplaying the value of the information we get from our five senses. Remember, for Plato, what our senses tell us about what's going on in this world can at best be only called opinion and at best true opinion. But the senses can never give us knowledge. It's reason when it puts us in touch with eternal truths, like the principles of geometry or basic moral concepts. It's reason that gives us real knowledge for Socrates and Plato. And we saw even for Descartes, he plays down the value of the information we get through our senses. We really know a material thing for Descartes from what the mind tells us, not our five senses. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about this distinction between basic empirical beliefs and derived or inferred beliefs, but they both relate to the information we get via our senses. In other words, what would confirm for the person in the picture that that there indeed is a telephone in front of, I guess it's her. I can remember when my brother and sister-in-law moved into their first apartment, right? And I mean, we're talking like mid-70s, right? But before it was as common as it is today to have women in traditionally male occupations, right? So I had some time off, and they were both working. They said, Vic, they're going to hook up our telephone. Can you just, be there in the apartment to let the telephone, man in, right? So this really attractive young woman shows up with a whole tool belt and everything on it, right? To install the phone, right? And she goes out there in back, had those spikes on, climbs up the pole, and connects it and comes down and does it. But so a basic empirical belief then is what we get directly from our senses, like seeing a red telephone creates in me the belief that there really is one sitting in front of me, or seeing this coffee cup confirms for me that there's a coffee cup sitting here. That's what justifies my belief that, or this person's belief that there's a phone there, and the fact that I can see and touch the coffee cup justifies my belief that I've got a cup of coffee here. But we also have beliefs that are nonetheless based on the senses, but not directly. It's only in science fiction movies like Jurassic Park that we see dinosaurs, right? None of us has ever seen a brontosaurus. However, we can infer that these creatures once lived from things like fossilized skeletons, fossilized footprints. So inferred empirical beliefs are beliefs that aren't about what is directly observable, but what we can infer from what is directly observable. Like we can infer that these animals once walked the earth. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that distinction. But one of the things that I tried to say is the rationalist position may seem a little odd to us because you and I have been conditioned to be empiricists in any science class we've ever been in. It's a very attractive theory of what constitutes knowledge, theory of knowledge. Beliefs based on empirical evidence seem reliable and objective both for everyday life and for observational sciences, right? I mean, in a practical sense, that seems to be an important way for us to get knowledge. Folks, I ask you to put your phones or type your conversations. But Descartes raised some issues that created problems not only for his own position, but for empiricism. And these problems persisted well into the 20th century. And these were problems that related to perception. And there's a word that I'm going to put on the board, and you're going to think I'm putting a different word on. But Descartes, you don't need to move because I'm just going to use the edge of this. Put us in what is called the egocentric predicament. The mind, or what Locke calls the understanding. Is acquainted only with its own, inner perceptions. These are what Locke calls ideas. This theory came to be called the theory of ideas. In other words, by speculating about things like, hey, maybe all the experiences we're having are part of a dream. What made that have some weight for Descartes is this view that the mind is acquainted first and foremost only with what's going on in the mind. And so the questions arise like, well, these perceptions that I have that I think are coming from things outside of me, like a real table here, could they in fact be just internally produced by the mind instead of being caused by outside objects like a table standing here? Or could, worse yet, the evil genius, the evil demon be creating these beliefs in me? And we saw Descartes tried to get us out of this predicament by trying to prove the existence of a God who's no deceiver. So when I think there's a table here, God would in a sense be a deceiver if there isn't a real table there. If my mind's creating this, if I'm dreaming, or he allows the evil genius to produce this image in me. So Descartes says, if there is a God and he's no deceiver, he's not going to deceive me when I think there's a real table here. So I can trust my senses after all. But we saw Descartes' reasoning was circular. He needs God to be around and be no deceiver to guarantee the truth of the principles like the cogito that he perceives clearly and distinctly. But how does he know that God's around and is no deceiver? Well, that's because he tries to prove the existence of God from his clear and distinct, necessarily true ideas. And the whole thing goes in a circle. The point that I want to stress is, essentially, Descartes raised this problem, and he didn't do a good job of getting us out of the egocentric predicament. One, because his way of doing it relied on a big circle in his reasoning, which proves nothing, which assumed what he was supposed to be proven, and also Descartes' way out relied on bringing into play what he thought was innate knowledge, his innate ideas. And we're going to see the empiricists reject that. But they have the problem So for John Locke, when we come into this world, the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank tablet or a blank slate, like that whiteboard over here. Now, they've just been updating our computers. I walked in the opposite chair with another adjunct this morning, and the old computer was gone and a new one was there. But I could still bring it up, and there was a lot of software on it of the kind that we use, Word, etc. And if you go into a big box retailer like Best Buy, or you buy a computer on the internet, it's going to have a lot of programs on it, right? Well, that's kind of like the way rationalists view our minds. They're like a hard drive that when we come in this world also already has a lot of information on it. It just needs to be brought out. That's the way Socrates and Plato viewed us. That's the way later rationalists like Descartes viewed us, as having innate ideas. Again, note NAT, natal, nativity, right? For Christians at Christmas time, the baby in the manger, right? Innate ideas are ideas we have at birth. Well, John Locke, it's not that John Locke just rejected this. There are 4 books to his main work in the theory of knowledge, the essay concerning human understanding, and he devotes most of an entire book to giving arguments against the rationalist position that we have innate knowledge, that we have knowledge at birth. But we're not going to look at Locke's arguments against that. If this were a high upper level course in, say, British empiricism, we would go there. But we're just looking at the basics of Locke's view. So for him, the mind is a blank tablet. And what writes information on the tablet? Well, it's experience after we're born. So our minds are like a blank hard drive. They still have the capacity to have information written on them, but there isn't anything there. And it's experience after birth that does this. Now, one of the claims of Plato, Socrates, and the later rationalists is there are some concepts that we have that don't seem to be ideas we got from experience. We talked about the concept of perfect equality, and Socrates arguing that for us to make an ordinary judgment, like 2 lines that we draw here are equal in length but not perfectly equal in length, we had to already know what perfect equality was. But no 2 lines are perfectly equal in this world, so Socrates argues we must have gotten the concept of perfect equality in the intellectual world, in the world of the forms before our soul became incarnated in this body. And later rationalists thought that God implants ideas like that in us. So if you're going to reject a belief in innate knowledge, it's incumbent on you as an empiricist to try to show how we can have some concepts that rationalists argue cannot have gotten into us via the senses, how we can nonetheless have them, like our ideas of perfection, infinity, and even our idea of God. Remember, for Descartes, the idea of God we saw in the ontological argument was for him innate. He even argues that it's only God himself who is perfect enough to create within him the perfect idea of God that he has, because there has to be as much reality in the cause as is in the effect. But Locke doesn't buy arguments like that. Now this is kind of an interesting thing about software. This was one of the earliest PowerPoints I ever did, and I was working in a very old version of PowerPoint. I think it was before PowerPoint 2000. And this graphic of a computer was right side up in the older version, and every subsequent version turns it upside down. And I haven't, and these are for reasons buried somewhere in the code, right? So it's not something that I could fix. I could cut and paste a different image in there, but I never thought it was worth the trouble of trying. But Locke tries to say, well, we can create an idea of, say, perfection. It doesn't have to be innate, by working on imperfect things and letting our imagination remove the imperfections. Now, I'm not real crazy about, here I have an example of, well, you could go from having an imperfect knowledge of computers to a perfect knowledge by simply removing the imperfections. I think it would be better to, think about a rose, right? You say, well, Plato's concept of the form of a rose is that it's perfect. It has no imperfections like we would see in a rose. So take the concept of a rose and remove any imperfections like misshapen petals, missing petals, a brown spot on it. And then you can get an idea of maybe what a perfect rose would be like. So do you see what Locke is saying is, these ideas that the rationalists all the way back to Socrates and Plato argued can't come from experience. For Locke and the empiricists, these ideas can be generated in us when our mind works with the data of experience, and they don't have to be innate. We know what it is to talk about limited space. So he says we could talk about unlimited or infinite space, or infinite duration in time, or infinite number, by imaginatively repeating and compounding things. It's very interesting, the word eternity that you get in Greek, in like the book of Revelation, where most translators translated eternity, but the literal Greek phrase is aistana ionion to ioniu, into the age of ages. They didn't have the same concept of infinite duration in time. So when they wanted to talk about something that gets translated as eternity, they talk about an age of ages, a lot of time, right? And this is the kind of thing that Locke is talking about here, that we can build up a concept of infinity or infinite duration in time or space from what we know about finite time and finite space. And this idea does not have to be innate. And similarly, he says, from our finite knowledge of qualities like contingent existence, we can talk about God's necessary existence, from limited duration in time, we can talk about eternity. But as I said, the literal phrase there is into the age of ages. From our limited knowledge, we can form a concept of God's omniscience, that God knows everything. From limited power, we can form the concept of God's being all-powerful. So for Locke, these concepts can be gotten or generated when our minds work on what experience does give us. And they don't have to be innate, like rationalists argued. So this is another way of saying we don't need to be talking about innate ideas. Now, the most important thing, and I may have to finish up Locke a little next time, the most important thing in understanding Locke's essay concerning human understanding is the way he uses idea. For Locke, idea is a narrow technical term for the immediate objects that the mind is acquainted with in its inner mental life. In other words, for Locke, what the mind perceives directly is its inner ideas. But for him, I have a complex idea of a table that for Locke was caused by a real table in the real world, and my inner idea is like a representation or picture of the table as it is in reality. So Locke believes that you and I do live in a real world of real objects. We're not in a dream world. We don't have an evil genius running around deceiving us. So how does he define idea as a technical term? Whatever is the object of the understanding. Think of the understanding as the part of us that is aware of the world, aware of things, sort of like the seat of our inner awareness of things. Whatever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks, and here it means man in the generic sense, any human being. Whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking. So ideas for him are whatever the mind has that it's dealing with. And what I like to say is ideas from Locke include not everything but the kitchen sink, but everything and the kitchen sink. Because for Locke, the kitchen sink is just a complex idea that we have. So look at the variety of things that can be ideas for Locke. When we talk about ideas, we often talk about abstract concepts, right? An idea like 2 + 2 = 4. And those would be ideas for Locke. But also objects of perception, like we're starting to see flowers come up, right? The smell of a spring flower, the sight of a bird. Ideas can come from us internally. On a day like this, we feel any aches and pains we have more. So, if I have a pain in the knee or the shoulder, that for Locke is also a perceived object, a perceived idea, or feelings of warmth and cold, or memory images. So note, all these things fall under the heading of ideas for Locke. And he says we have two sources, and not going to spend a lot of time on this, but basically, we have ideas that come from what we can observe outside of us, right? And they concern qualities like colors, feelings of heat and cold, softness, hardness. But he says we also have internal ideas that we get from reflecting on what goes on inside our own minds. And here, note, we get, by reflecting, the kinds of things that Descartes said characterize the mind. We can reflect and see that going on in us are mental operations like perceiving things, doubting or believing something, going through a process of reasoning, say in math, knowing, willing something. He says these are inner ideas. Now, again, for Locke, it seems like we're getting really technical, and we are. We're examining the leaves on the trees, but these, what seem to be very narrow distinctions, had terrific import in eventually what we could claim to know or not know about the world around us. So for Locke, there are two kinds of ideas, simple and complex. And basically, complex ideas are ideas that are a combination of various simple ideas together. And here's how I can illustrate it. Take a telephone like this. I always joke now that there's going to be a time when I put a slide up here and somebody raises their hand and says, telephone? That's no telephone. You know, these things are telephones. What is that you got? Right? And more of us are getting rid of our landlines. But the idea I have of, say, a telephone that's sitting in front of me, an old type of dial phone like this, is, for Locke, a complex idea, but it includes a series of simple ideas that relate to the various properties the telephone has. It includes many simple ideas like its red color, its shape that's kind of square, feelings I might get from touch like coolness, hardness of the case, the size I perceive it to have. If I lift it up, its weight, and the sound if it rings. In other words, all of these ideas come together to form the complex idea we have of a telephone in front of us. Okay, I do want to look at, Monday, we'll look at primary and secondary qualities or properties, and that, because it's very important to see what's going on with Locke if we do that.